Okay, so what we're going to do today is finish up with the Beliefs of Self-Fulfilling Prophecy lecture and move on to the lecture on focus and how focus creates reality. Where did we end last time? We ended by talking about arena and other things. We talked about the model, the Dan Gilbert model, the Philip Brickman model, where after a failure or a success, there is a spike up, spike down, but then we recover. And we basically move along a base level of well-being throughout our lives, with the ups and downs, the vicissitudes. The question then became, or rather there was good news and bad news. The good news was we don't really need to worry that much and we can take more risks, we can put ourselves on the line more. Failure usually, not all failures, but usually is just a temporary decline in our well-being level, self-esteem level, and then very quickly we jump up again. So that's the good news. The bad news is, if we're just around the same base level, why should we put any effort into our well-being? And the answer to that, and the whole course essentially is an answer to that, how can we raise that base level? One of the things is coping, putting ourselves on the line. And the reason why coping, why putting ourselves on the line yields positive results in terms of the base level of well-being going up, meaning still the ups and downs, but ups and downs looking this way as opposed to around a straight line or a parallel line, is that when we cope, we see ourselves coping, we see ourselves trying, and through self-perception theory, we derive certain conclusions about ourselves. Oh, I must be courageous. Oh, I must be a person who has high self-esteem. Oh, I must be a person who has a strong desire to succeed, and so on and so on. And then we derive conclusions about ourselves in the same way that we derive conclusions about other people. That is self-perception theory. The second reason is that once we start failing more often, we realize that actually it's not that bad. It's not what we make it out to be. The pain that in our minds we associate with failure is far greater than the actual pain of failure when that comes. Maybe not initially when it happens, but after a while. And then we'll recover again and we see, oh, I can deal with it. I must be a person with resilience. And finally, there is more success as a result of coping. Learn to fail or fail to learn. There is no other way to succeed. So what I want to move on to now and just finish up on is, how do we become more of an optimist? So we talked about the virtues. We talked about longevity. People who are optimistic actually live longer. We talked about higher levels of success, higher levels of happiness, more likely to overcome depression. People who are optimistic are 8 times less likely to be depressed. They're much more likely to be happy. And again, optimism as an interpretation style, not as a Pollyannish feel-good kind of approach. So how do we become more of an optimist? And I want to talk about 3 techniques. First is to take action, to just do it, to put ourselves on the line. Second, I'm going to talk about the power of imagination, visualization. Many of you are familiar with it, especially athletes, as a technique, so we'll talk about that technique. And finally, cognitive therapy, which, at least according to research, is the most successful, most effective therapeutic intervention out there today. So we'll talk about some of the basics and summarize those. So let me begin with action. This is based on research by Albert Bandura. You read about self-efficacy. His concept, basically the idea of having strong beliefs, and he just made it more academic, more scientific, and researched it for many years. And we talked about the many benefits of self-efficacy. What Bandura is coming out against in much of his work is what has become known as the self-esteem movement, or he's coming against what has become known as the feel-good movement. All right, so tell a child how great they are, how wonderful they are. Stand in front of a mirror every morning and tell yourself, hi gorgeous 10 times. And then you'll be more successful, your self-esteem will be higher, and you'll be more gorgeous. It doesn't work. Believe me, it doesn't work. I've tried everything. The thing, though, is that very often it actually hurts in the long term. It actually hurts self-esteem. It actually hurts the motivation of students who are constantly told you're wonderful, you're terrific, no matter what. And we'll talk about how we can be more discerning with praise, how we can praise in the right way when we talk about the work of Carol Dweck on mindset in a few weeks. But in the meantime, what Bandura showed, what Carol Dweck showed, what many others showed, was that it's not enough. Very often, it's even detrimental to just give the positive talk, the positive affirmation, whether it comes from the outside or from the inside. Maybe part of the equation, certainly can't be all. What Bandura is saying that rather than talk, we need action. We need to put hard work into whatever it is we want to be more confident about, and we need to cope. We need to put ourselves on the line. Very simple. Why? Because hard work and coping inevitably leads to success. More success, at least, than we had before when we didn't act and we didn't cope. So even if it's a little bit, that in and of itself contributes, that success contributes to our self-efficacy, to our self-confidence. And then that self-confidence in turn motivates us to work harder. We start to believe in ourselves more. Now, this is a very simple model. I mean, anyone, a 5-year-old could draw that model. However, think about the implications for our lives. Think about the implications for education. Do we just tell students constantly, you're terrific, you're wonderful, you're great? Or do we, like Marva Collins, make them actually work hard so that they succeed more, so that they see themselves, going back to self-perception theory, see themselves working hard, see themselves putting themselves on the line and coping and failing and getting up again? It works also in a similar way to our physical immune system. When we get sick, when we get ill, our body sends antibodies and we actually become immune to whatever it is that we had. So our body becomes immunized through failure. Same on the psychological level. Failure is underrated. One of the things that I wish for you, and I mean it genuinely, one of the things that I wish for you is that you fail more. I'm not saying it in jest, I really do. And coupled with that, I hope that when you fail, you will also learn to interpret it in a different way than most of us usually interpret failure. Because there is no other way to succeed. There is no other way for growth. It's an illusion that a life looks like this. And we'll talk about it much more when we talk about perfectionism. A healthy life, a real life, and a happy life ultimately looks like this. A spiral with ups and downs, not as a straight line. When we see ourselves cope, when we see ourselves work hard, we derive conclusions about ourselves. Our self-confidence goes up, our motivation goes up, our belief goes up, and so on in an upward spiral of growth. Soren Kierkegaard, to dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. Not to dare is to lose oneself. To lose one's footing temporarily is the failure that comes inevitably when we cope, when we try, when we have high expectations. Not to dare is to lose oneself. That is when we don't cope, when we avoid. Because this model also works the other way around. When we constantly avoid challenges, when we constantly shun difficult experiences, when we don't give ourselves the permission to fail, a downward spiral is created in terms of our self-esteem, in terms of our success, in terms of our well-being. Second technique, imagining success. Now, there's one thing I want to share with you. I'm a little bit nervous about sharing it, but I'll do it anyway. Since we've opened up, I think especially last time was a real milestone in our relationship. So I'm going to tell you something, but please don't tell anyone. especially don't tell any of my clients or potential clients in the future, I get really nervous before lectures. I get very nervous. In fact, for me, whenever I stand in front of a large audience, there are butterflies in my stomach. And it's very difficult for me. When I talk about large audience, it's anything above 5. So this is a real challenge, and it's a real challenge when I talk to clients. And this has been a challenge since the day I decided that I wanted to be a teacher. And I decided that I wanted to be a teacher when I heard of Marva Collins. And I said, this is my calling. And here is what happened then. I said, how can I be a successful teacher, an effective teacher, if I get so nervous when I stand in front of an audience? And remember the 3 components of success, the secret of success? It was optimism, belief in oneself. It was passion, loving what you do. And it was hard work. So I had 2 of the 3 components. I worked extremely hard. In fact, my motto has become one that I got from Professor Richard Hackman. He was my thesis advisor as an undergrad here. And what he said, he's a phenomenal teacher, and what he says when he goes into a classroom is the following: prepare, 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 and then be spontaneous. So I followed his advice. I read over my notes, I have all the notes written down, and then I can let go. So I prepare a lot. I have the hard work, not a problem. I have the passion. I love learning. It's the most important thing professionally in my life. But I lacked the 3rd thing. I lacked optimism and I lacked confidence. And then I asked myself, so how can I raise this 3rd component? Because it is an important component of well-being. Remember when the research on athletes, 56% of the variance is accounted of success is accounted for by the sense of optimism or belief in yourself. Remember the John Kotter study, 20 years longitudinal, looking at Harvard Business School graduates. One of the 2 components that differentiated the most successful from the rest, one of them was belief in themselves, confidence. It's an important component of success, and I lacked that. So what did I do? I went back and thought about what happened when I played squash, or what my coaches used to teach me, and that was visualization. And I started reading up on it, looking at the literature, and there's a lot of research on it. It actually started off centuries ago in religious practices. Was brought to athletics through Eastern European athletes who would imagine themselves, say, running around the track and then standing on the podium receiving the gold medal. And more psychologists started to implement it. Salespeople use it very effectively, seeing themselves actually striking the deal, going through with it, doing it, succeeding. And that made it much more likely to come true. The question is why? What's the mechanism behind visualization? Why is it so important? Why is it so good? Why is it so effective? Why is it being used so widely and successfully? And the answer goes back to the structure of our brains. This is research done by the head of the psychology department, Professor Stephen Coslin. What he shows was that when we see something, so let's say I'm looking at my hand right now, there are certain neurons in my brain that are firing, that actually take on the shape of this hand, my visual cortex, the back. Now, if I close my eyes and imagine that I'm looking at this hand, even if it's not there, if I imagine that I look at this hand, the exact same neurons are firing. In other words, my brain does not know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. Which explains why dreams can be so vivid. Middle of the night, pitch dark, and you're dreaming about middle of the day, walking around the yard. Our imagination, at least for the brain, is no different than the real thing. Now, when I imagine success, what happens in a sense is that I'm creating a simulator for my mind. And I'm, in a sense, fooling my mind into thinking that this is the real thing. My mind doesn't know the difference between the two. Subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. Now, if I imagine success over and over again in my mind, remember, what the mind does not like is inconsistency. In other words, if I create success in my imagination and I persist with it, not just visualize it once or twice, but over and over again, the mind doesn't like inconsistencies, and therefore it will bring up the external reality to match this internal schema. Why? Because the mind doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. Just like Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile, and after that, what happened was that everyone had a different schema. Oh, 4-minute mile is possible, and 37 runners run it. Over 300 runners run it the following year. Because they had a different schema, we can do exactly the same thing through the simulator. Because the mind doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. Doesn't work all the time, doesn't work 100% of the time, but it works a great deal. What I do every time when I give a lecture is visualize. I imagine myself standing in front of the audience, calm, excited, passionate, and then when I go into the real thing, now I don't know if this is the real thing or I'm imagining, but I'm assuming it's the real thing. When I go into the real thing, I do feel that. I still get nervous, I still get anxious, but it's a healthy excitement. Raising my levels of belief, levels of confidence by practicing. Just like a pilot you would hope would practice in a simulator before they take you on across the Atlantic. The mind as a simulator. This is why it works. The key here, this is a mistake that many people make, whether it's in athletics or whether it's in a lot of the self-help books that talk about visualizations. The key is to focus not just on the destination. Shelley Taylor, UCLA, did this research where she divided students into two random groups. One student imagined themselves getting an A on the exam and imagined it over and over again. The second group imagined themselves getting an A, but also saw themselves work and persist in the library, prepare for it, and then get to that final A. The second group that imagined both the journey and the destination was much more successful, much better result in the exam. So visualize the journey as well as the destination. This is your response paper for this week. To visualize both your destination of getting there, your journey of getting there, as well as the destination itself. Arguably the most, or certainly one of the most influential speeches of all time was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. I've read this speech more than dozens of times. Why? Because beyond its beauty and its rhythm and its importance, it also captures what it means to create an image of success. Because this is what he did for this country and defined generations to come. So first of all, I want to read some excerpts from it. It is about visualizing a better future. I mean, he says it explicitly, he doesn't hide it. He says, I have a dream. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. This is all about imagination. But through the imagination, he created a better reality. Look at how he talks about the process. He doesn't talk just about the outcome. We want equality at the end. He talks about how we will get to this outcome. So let me read you a couple of excerpts. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. How beautiful. I mean, what he's saying here is, let's not just sit around and wait and imagine that things will happen. Let's do something. Let's also have a process. And he says this explicitly. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. So here he's talking about advice, of suggestions, advice, what we should and shouldn't do along the way. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. He's describing a process. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. Another thing that we need to do when we imagine success is to make it as real as possible by involving as many senses as we can. Why? Because the more senses we can imagine, the more our mind is fooled to believe that it's the real thing. Once again, Martin Luther King does this beautifully. Let me read you a few excerpts. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I mean, you can feel the water. You can feel that stream. You can see it. You can visualize it. Or, let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. He's employing taste. Bitterness, equating it with hatred. People connect to it, making it real, concrete. One day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I mean, you can see that circle of the kids holding hand. Again, making it real. You can visualize it. You see it. By the way, these are the characteristics of all great speeches. They're not abstract. Look at the great communicator, Ronald Reagan. Look at Kennedy. Look at their amazing speeches because they created a picture. They involved the senses. They created a picture of success. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. You can actually feel the heat. You can actually feel the sweat that he's describing. This is what makes good, successful images. This is what makes great speeches. And finally, it's about evoking emotions. You don't want to just make it a cognitive exercise. You want to really be excited about what you're doing, or else it will fall flat. Nothing, no change will happen. Again, the connection between the words emotion and motion. Without emotion, there is no motion. If you want to move yourself or others, you need to evoke emotions. Let's look at just a minute of that historical speech.
From every mountainside, let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Now, I've seen this, as I said, dozens of times. Every time, excitement. Imagine if we said at the end, free at last, God Almighty, free at last. Would that have the same effect? Boring. Dry. You have to evoke emotions to create motion, whether it's in our imagination or in a speech to the nation. Another technique that I'd like to talk about, the third technique. So the first one was work. Put yourself on the line. Cope. Invest. The second, use your imagination. Use the simulator that you have right here. One of the most, if not the most powerful simulator we know of. The third is cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy has been used very successfully over the last over 40 years. Marty Seligman was one of the founders of the cognitive therapy approach. He studied with Beck, who was the official founder of this technique and this approach. And what cognitive therapy is about is the following. Its basic premise is that thoughts drive emotion. So, for example, there is an external event. I perceive that event, and what I do then, after I perceive that event, there is evaluation of that event. In other words, a thought about that event. And then, as a result of that thought, that evokes an emotion. So, for example, an event, a lion is running toward me. My evaluation, oh my God, he's going to eat me. The emotion, fear, and that of course leads to motion. Run away or stand up bravely and fight the lion. Or another one, I see an event, a gorgeous woman walking down the street. My evaluation, oh, it's my gorgeous wife. And the emotion, love. Event, evaluation, thought, emotion, and then that leads to action. What cognitive therapy says is that if we want to change emotions, whether it's of depression, whether it's of anxiety, where we need to intervene is here, is at the level of evaluation, at the level of thought. And if we can change that, we also change our emotion. Specifically, what cognitive therapy is saying is that we need to restore a sense of rationality. We need to restore the real. It's certainly not saying, let's say I have a very important tryout coming up, and I get nervous. Cognitive therapy is not saying, stop feeling nervous, let's change your evaluation or your thoughts, because that's natural. Or I stand in front of a lion. It's natural, it's important, it's healthy to experience fear. But what it is saying is that sometimes our thoughts are irrational. And we mentioned it last time. For example, I don't do well on one test, and immediately I classify myself as stupid, or the fact that I will never succeed in tests again. Or, I ask someone out and he says no, and suddenly nobody wants me. That event led to an irrational thought, irrational evaluation of the situation. It was just once, it was temporary. And that led to a difficult emotion such as resignation. Nobody will ever want me again. And what cognitive therapy does is just restore that rationality by saying, yeah, it hurts, it's tough, but, there are, 3,200 other men at Harvard. Cognitive therapy has been shown to be extremely effective, more effective than any of the other interventions. The jury's still out when it comes to extreme cases of psychopathology. But in terms of most psychopathologies, most anxiety, most depression, it has been shown to be the most successful, and it works the fastest. Not the only thing that works, but it works the best and much more promptly than the other interventions. On the whole, not right for everyone, but for most people. And finally, and this is the important thing, we can learn it. So we talked about, the 5-year Cambridge Somerville study that failed. Well, Karen Rivich teaches these cognitive skills in a 2-week program. And that 2-week program helps kids in inner cities, at-risk population, reduce the likelihood of falling into the trap of depression, of drug abuse, increases the likelihood of well-being and success in the long term, just as a result of 2 weeks teaching them cognitive therapy. or these techniques. So it's an acquired skill, and this is the important thing about it. That does not mean it's easy. It doesn't mean you're just going to hear a lecture now. For the next 10 minutes, I'm going to describe some of the ideas, and that's going to change your life. You need to apply it, and you are going to apply it in the next two classes, but you need to do more than that. So let me share with you a summary of cognitive therapy, and the 3 M's, it's my acronym, and what I did there was put together essentially the work of Karen Rivich, whom I just mentioned, the work of Marty Seligman, the work of Aaron Beck, Seligman's teacher, and the work of David Burns. Some of you may have heard of him, the Feeling Good Handbook, who was also a student of Aaron Beck. So this is putting together their work into 3 M's, subdivided each one into two suggestions. They're interconnected, as you will see. It's not a very clear distinction. However, what you will notice is you can usually relate to 1 or 2 of the 3 M's, things that you do yourself. So be on the lookout. Ask yourselves, where do I distort reality? Where do I have distortions in terms of my evaluations, in terms of my thought, that lead to certain negative emotions that are unnecessary? Because if I restore rationality, I will not feel the same emotion to the same degree. So ask yourself as you look through the 3 M's. The 3 M's, essentially the 3 traps of irrational thought. The first one is magnifying. It's exaggerating something that happens. For example, it's overgeneral. Induction is something very natural. A kid sees this, and, we call it a stool, and then they see another stool in the bar when they go out at the age of 1, and then they see another stool, and after they see 20 stools, they begin to form a concept. They induce that this is a stool. And now they see one, even one that they had never seen before, they know what it is. Just like I see a person on the street whom I've never encountered before, I know this is a person because I induce from all the other events that happened before that this is also a person. So that's induction, that's healthy, that's important, that's how we develop concepts and language. But sometimes we take this too far and we overgeneralize. Once again, I did poorly on a midterm. Conclusion, generalization, I'm just not smart. I just can't succeed here as a student. Overgeneralization, the evaluation, the thought, irrational. Or, he just said no to me. Everyone's going to say no. Instead of being realistic and saying, wow, just look around, there are so many wonderful, sensitive, and caring men in 1504. So, another thing, and this is something we'll talk about a lot, the all or nothing approach. The all or nothing, we'll talk about it when we talk about perfectionism. It's catastrophizing failure, not seeing failure as an opportunity, as a stepping stone, but seeing it as the end of the world. I got to be as a freshman, now I'm going to be homeless and not find a job ever. All or nothing, either straight A's or complete failure. And we'll talk about that a lot, because that is one of the key elements that prevents us from trying, from coping, from putting ourselves on the line. The other side of it, which is actually the other side of the same coin, is minimizing. This is something that I do very often. This is my trap that I still have to be aware of and I still think about today, even though I became aware of it years ago. Only now I catch myself doing it much more promptly. So the first idea of minimizing is what Karen Rivich calls tunnel vision. What is tunnel vision? For example, let's say I have 620 students in my class. And out of the 620 students, 618 are engaged in the material. One is looking at the ceiling, at the lights, and another one out of the 620 students is asleep. Tunnel vision is when I focus on that one person who is asleep, and I say to myself, wow, I'm giving boring, sleep-inducing lectures. Or the other way around. I have 620 students, 618 are asleep, one is looking around, and one is going, whoa, whoa. And I only focus on that person, and I say, I'm a great lecturer, I'm so inspiring. Again, it's unrealistic, one way or the other. And what cognitive therapy does is bring realism into the equation. Again, this is something that I often fall into. And just recently, I fell into this. And it happened, I know many of you saw the Jon Stewart show. So what happened in the Jon Stewart show, he was so fast, way too fast for me. I felt like I was, 2 questions behind, still contemplating and thinking and saying, well, this could be interesting research, John. And he was already, 10 steps ahead. So I felt behind, I felt slow, and I also said something that I later regretted. It was just one sentence, no big deal, but that is what I focused on. I flew home after, I went back to Israel, and the whole flight, that's what I was thinking of. Ignoring the other things, the fact that 2 hours after the Jon Stewart show, the book became a bestseller. Completely ignored that, didn't exist as far as I was concerned. It was just that one sentence. How could I say it? Why didn't I prepare for it better? And so on. And then I suddenly said, hey, wait a minute, tunnel vision, and I zoomed out. I looked at the bigger picture. And then I said, okay, so I said something that I regret. Big deal, it's a comedy, it's fun. So many people, so many of you friends have watched and enjoyed it. It was a great opportunity. And I looked at the bigger picture, gave myself the permission to be human, to regret it, but then overall could see it in a much more rational light than before. So again, as I said, I still apply, I still use these ideas. In the past, it would take me months to get over this one sentence. Whereas now, zoom out, evaluation, thought, irrational, and recover much more promptly. Dismissal of positives or negatives. So the person who has tunnel vision doesn't see the other 618 people who are engaged or asleep. The person who dismisses the positives sees those, but says they're unimportant, they're trivial in comparison to how I just failed or what I just did wrong. So for example, this again, something a trap that I often fall into. When I was a senior, I applied for fellowships, and I got a fellowship to go to Cambridge. And I got the John Eliot Fellowship. And there are 4 fellowships that go to Cambridge. It's the John Eliot, it's the Fisk, and one other, Pembroke, and then there is the John Harvard Fellowship. So I got the John Eliot, one of the 4. Immediately when I got it, I knew that I got it, obviously. It wasn't that I was ignoring it. But I said, why didn't I get the John Harvard Fellowship? Now, there's no difference between them except for the name. But that's immediately where my mind went to. And that was a very important experience for me, because I said, wow, look at you. And that's when I started to recognize the importance and the power of our evaluation and how that can determine and even ruin what should have been a celebration. But once we recognize it, once we understand it, we can dispute it. We can challenge it. We can reframe it. And see the positive as well. Again, all it's saying, cognitive therapy, is let's be real. Making up or fabricating, the third M. This is when we create something ex nihilo, from nothing. So for example, we personalize it or we blame. We see this very often, with people who are abused. So an abused wife would very often say, it's my doing, it's my fault, I'm not behaving appropriately. Instead of rationally saying, this guy is abusive, I'm out of here. That's irrational personalization. It can also be the other way around. I just did poorly on an exam, and I blame my boyfriend or girlfriend for it. That's also unrealistic. I need to take responsibility. Again, remember Nathaniel Branden, no one is coming. Take responsibility rather than blame. One of the key ideas that Marva Collins communicates to her students. So again, it's not going to the personalization, over-personalizing or over-blaming. It's being real. And finally, emotional reasoning. I'm envious, therefore I must be a bad person. Or I'm experiencing danger before a tryout, therefore it must be dangerous. Taking an emotion and making it into reality, whereas instead of understanding, an emotion is an emotion. It doesn't necessarily capture reality. It is my evaluation of reality. Or I'm extremely scared of failing, and therefore it means that failing is really dangerous. Well, in fact, it's not. I'll get back up again very quickly. So it's having the correct evaluation, correcting for the trap, correcting for these errors. Or feeling that I'm second-rate, that I'm no good in psychology or math. And because I feel that, my evaluation of it is, well, I must really be second-rate and no good. Instead of having the rational belief of, well, let me try out, let me see how things go, correcting the distortions. The key, once again, is to get real. How do we get real? Through the questions that we ask. I'm going to give you just a few examples here. You're going to practice with those on your own, but here are just some of them. First of all, is my conclusion tied to reality? Second, is it rational? They're interconnected. Am I ignoring something important? Like the fact that, the book did well afterwards, like the fact that there are other cool guys in 1504, and so on. What important evidence do I still need to take into consideration? This is about disputing. It's evidence. It's get real. Look out. Don't just zoom in on the geometric shapes. There are also children on the bus. And this is what questions do. They open us up. They open our vision. And they create a new reality. What am I magnifying? What am I minimizing? Am I falling into one of the traps? Am I ignoring anything that is going well? Am I ignoring anything that is not going well? It's not about Pollyanna feel-good at all costs. It's about being tied to reality. And finally, let me zoom out. What is the big picture? To conclude, Ed Dinner and Marty Seligman did very important research on extremely happy people. This is tip of the stem research, looking at the 10% of the happiest people out there, people that we can learn from. And what they found was very interesting. First of all, these people did not experience painful emotions any less times than the rest of the people. Say the bottom 10% or the mid 10%. They experienced painful emotions. The difference between them and the rest was that they recovered more promptly as a result of different interpretations. So when they felt down, they were optimists. Instead of saying, okay, so I'm going to feel down for the rest of the month, they said, okay, so I'm feeling down. Big deal. What can I learn from it? What happened? How can I make myself feel better? And then they recovered more promptly than the pessimists, the people who remained depressed for much longer time. You see, events happen. Things happen in the world. Very often out of our control. We don't create everything that we encounter. And some of the events are bad, some are negative. What matters more is what we do with them after, how we evaluate them. And what happens is that our evaluation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because a pessimist will say, I'm in a bad mood now, it's going to last for a very long time, it's not going to go away. Whereas an optimist says, it's temporary, it's going to go away. And beliefs are self-fulfilling prophecies. If I believe that it will last for 6 months, it's much more likely, not necessarily, but it's much more likely to last for 6 months than if I say, that too shall pass. what we do with our beliefs is we create a downward spiral of depression, unhappiness, sadness, or an upward spiral, capitalizing on positive emotions and having more and more of them. What Barbara Fredrickson talks about, the broaden and build phenomenon. A lot of it is up to us. There are no shortcuts. There are no easy steps to well-being, to success, to high levels of belief in ourselves. It takes work, it takes effort, whether it's work visualizing, whether it's hard work and coping, or whether it's work learning to dispute irrational thoughts. And it's not enough to just understand it once and then we're all set, we're inoculated for the rest of our lives. If we wanted to continue working, we have to continue working at it. Let me move on. And talk about the question of focus. Because just like if we focus on a specific element of an event or not makes a difference, it applies on the macro level to our entire life. What I'm going to do now is elaborate, go at higher level of the spiral of understanding and learning of something that we've talked about time and again. Ed Diner, who's also, whom I just mentioned his research, he's also the first president of the International Positive Psychology Association. He's from Illinois. After years of research, concludes, it appears that the way people perceive the world is much more important to happiness than objective circumstances. Now, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. We know a lot of people who seemingly have everything, whether it's wealth, whether it's wonderful friends and family, all their dreams have come true, and they're still miserable, where there are people who have very little, who have experienced hardship after hardship, and who never cease to celebrate life. Then there are people who have everything going for them and really appreciate it, don't take it for granted, and are happy. And then there are people who don't have much and never cease to complain. In other words, it's not just the internal, it's not just the external that matters. What matters more is the internal. Happiness is not contingent on our status or the state of our bank account. It's much more dependent on our state of mind, on what we choose to focus on. Because our emotions are determined by external circumstances as well as internal. Interpretation matters. So, for example, look at what Edison did. 5,000 failures to the external observer. For him, the evaluation was very different. The internal evaluation, the subjective evaluation, it was 5,000 times where I showed what doesn't work. And it's up to us to decide where we focus. Do we celebrate successes or take it for granted? Do we perceive failures and hardships as a disaster or as an opportunity for growth? Emerson, to different minds, the same world is a hell and a heaven. And Shakespeare, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Now, I don't 100% agree with Shakespeare, but he is, to a great extent, right. A person in Darfur is living in hell. And it's very difficult to reframe and to derive and to look at the positive in that situation. Same for a person living in a concentration camp. So there are external circumstances that matter. A homeless person, you know, if you give them enough money for a home, for food, for basic education, of course will become happier because of a change in external circumstances. However, beyond the basic needs, beyond the basic freedoms, it is mostly about how we perceive reality, and we're able to make it into a heaven or hell. Let's do an exercise that will capture this idea of focus creating reality. So I have a question for you. How many geometric shapes do you? Unfortunately, it's a great exercise, but it only works once. Remember this, how you created your reality, just based on the question that you asked. We think when we look at a picture, now everyone, of course, is looking on the children on the bus and the clock, right? But before, it was right in front of you, and most of you did not see it. Because it is a question of focus. Very often we complain about life and we say, things are terrible and awful, not realizing that we're the cause of it. Either by imagining it and then beliefs become self-fulfilling prophecies, or because we just focus on what is not working. And once again, this does not mean that there are no objective, terrible circumstances out there. But to a great extent, we co-create our reality. Now, one of the students who was in 1504 2 years ago recommended this book to me, Way of the Peaceful Warrior. And it's a wonderful book. I just started reading it. And there's a movie on it, right? I just started reading it yesterday, and I came across this, coincidentally, this parable. So I want to read it to you. It's a story that Dan Millman, the author, tells. I met him on a construction site in the Midwest. When the lunch whistle blew, all the workers would sit down together to eat. And every day, Sam would open his lunch pail and start to complain. Son of a gun, he'd cry. Not peanut butter and jelly sandwich again. I hate peanut butter and jelly. He whined about his peanut butter and jelly sandwiches day after day after day, until one of the guys on the work crew finally said, Sam, if you hate peanut butter and jelly so much, why don't you just tell your old lady to make you something different? What do you mean, my old lady? Sam replied. I'm not married. I make my own sandwiches. Now, very often we make our own sandwiches and we don't even notice it. Because the questions that we ask determine our reality. A peanut butter sandwich, or geometric shapes, or children on the bus, or salami, whatever it is. We very often create our own reality. And if we understand this, we can transform, change the way that we perceive, change our focus, change our questions. Whether it's questions disputing irrational evaluations, whether it's questions focusing on the positive. And the questions create a new reality. There are essentially two archetypes that I'd like to discuss here. Two archetypes that capture, in many ways, how we can cognitively reconstruct and hence create our reality. The two archetypes are the benefit finder and the fault finder. First of all, the fault finder. The fault finder is a person who always focuses on things that don't work, on the peanut butter and jelly, on things that are not going well, on problems in the relationships, on problem in him or herself, problems with the job, the consummate complainer. Now, we all exist on the continuum of between extreme fault finding and extreme benefit finding. There's no one who is all the way on the extreme this way or that way. Everyone is on somewhere on the continuum, and what I'm going to argue for is to move a little bit more from the fault finding toward the benefit finding, because there are many benefits to it that I'll discuss later. The fault finder, I got the name from the work of Henry David Thoreau. The fault finder will find faults even in paradise. The extreme fault finder experiences resignation, learned helplessness. Why? Because he or she begins to really believe that the terrible reality is very much out there, independent of what he or she thinks, not recognizing that they create that reality. They begin to believe that no matter what they do, no matter what job they find, they have a terrible boss. No matter what partner they have, they're always awful and inconsiderate. No matter what restaurant they go to, the service is always awful. And they always keep on getting the same peanut butter and jelly sandwich that they made for themselves. And they resigned to the reality, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, of course, their existence. A fault finder makes lemonade out of lemons. Sorry, makes lemon out of lemonade. The benefit finder, research Julian Bauer, now at UCLA. The benefit finder is the opposite, focuses on what works. The benefit finder looks on the bright side of life, finds the silver lining in a dark cloud, makes lemonade out of lemons, and doesn't fault an instructor for using too many cliches. The benefit finder finds the miracle in the common. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a consummate benefit finder, focusing on the positive, on what works. Now, the problem here may be that the benefit finder may be detached. This is one of the criticisms of people who always see the bright side of life. And that is a problem, if that is the case. Again, this class is not advocating focusing only on the positive. It's advocating reality. And reality comprises both good and bad. Reality comprises both geometric shapes and children on the bus. And the key is to focus on both. So the detached benefit finder is certainly not an archetype that I would advocate, nor would it lead to mental health in the long run. There's a need, in the words of Nathaniel Branden, to respect reality. We don't create reality simply by the focus. However, we are co-creators. Let me read you extensively from William James. Now, however fixed these elements of reality may be, we still have a certain freedom in our dealings with them. Take our sensations. That they are is undoubtedly beyond our control, but which we attend to, note, and make emphatic in our conclusions depends on our own interests, and, according as we lay the emphasis here or there, quite different formulations of truth result. We read the same facts differently. Waterloo, with the same fixed details, spells a victory for an Englishman. For a Frenchman, it spells defeat. So for an optimist philosopher, the universe spells victory. For a pessimist, defeat. What we say about reality thus depends on the perspective into which we throw it. William James said this back in 1890, in understanding how we co-create our reality. Here's one of my favorite poems by R.L. Sharp. Isn't it strange how princes and kings and clowns that caper in sawdust rings and common people like you and me are builders for eternity? Each is given a list of rules, a shapeless mass, a bag of tools, and each must fashion ere life is flown a stumbling block or a stepping stone. Very often what we get at the beginning is a large piece of stone. What do we do with it? Do we create it into a beautiful David, chipping away the excess stone, or is it a barrier to our success? And very often it is up to us as we co-create our reality. The stone is there. We're not responsible for it, but what we do with it, we are responsible for. Cognitive reconstruction is about learning to interpret things optimistically. In other words, in a positive light. Anne Harbison, colleague of mine, used to teach also with Philip Stone, said that never let a good crisis go to waste. Crises have the potential for growth. One of the books that we'll talk about when we talk about relationships is Passionate Marriage by David Schnark, who talks about crucibles in marriage. And what he says is that the thriving relationships are relationships not that have been, all fine and dandy for years. These usually fail after a while. But the relationships that go through crucibles, that have crises, disagreements, and then, thesis, antithesis, and then there is a synthesis. Then there is growth as a result of these hardships. And he says that there is no other way. Again, learn to fail or fail to learn. There is no other way for long-term success of a relationship. A relationship cannot look like this. It has to have the ups and downs. Never let a good crisis in a relationship go to waste. That doesn't mean that every crisis needs to be resolved, and there are some that could end and should end a relationship. But most crises can be solved and need to be dealt with. Same on an individual level. Work by Warren Bennis. He's from USC, taught for a few years here at the business school. Has identified the leading leaders, whether it's young ones, whom he called the geeks, the 30-year-olds, or the old ones, the geezers, he called them. He has a book called Geeks and Geezers, where he talks about the differences between the two leadership styles, approaches, passions, interests, and there are numerous differences. For example, the geeks, the young ones, talk about work-life balance. The geezers don't know what he means by that. It was usually a man, worked while the woman took care of the family and the man. So that was for the geezers, for the older generation. The younger generation, they talk about work-life balance and how they can incorporate all the elements of their lives. There are, of course, many more women in the geeks than the geezers. Numerous differences among the generation. One similarity. All the great leaders, whether they were 30-year-old or 85 years old, all of them had been through very rough crucibles and lived to tell the tale. Now, most people go through crucibles, but there are certain people who are able to find benefit in these crucibles and grow as a result. Never let a good crisis go to waste, whether it's professionally, whether it's interpersonally, whether it's intrapersonally, in terms of what you're experiencing. About 4 years ago or 5 years ago, when I was still a resident tutor in Leverett House, we had one of these pre-business events where we talked about the upcoming year and the recruiting and so on. That particular year was a terrible year. Goldman Sachs was laying off, wasn't recruiting on campus. Credit Suisse, First Boston, they were laying off as well. Deutsche Bank, first time in its history, was laying off employees. Really bad market. And we talked about this. Each of us gave a spiel about the market and what they can do. Very, very somber presentation. And then one of my students, Shane Fitzcoy, was a senior then, was sitting there, had studied positive psychology there, put up his hand and said, Tal, you portrayed a very pessimistic and negative picture, but as the teacher of positive psychology, can you maybe shed some optimism here? And, a few chuckles in the audience and then silence. And everyone is looking at me and I don't know what to say. And my immediate reaction was to say, well, Shane, things happen for the best. Exactly. And then, just before it came out of my mouth, I thought to myself, actually, I don't believe that. I don't believe that things happen for the best. But while I don't believe that things happen for the best, I do believe that some people are able to make the best of things that happen. And there's a very big difference here. Because when I say I'm not happy about what just happened here. I don't like it. I much rather have the market be a good market, where people are hiring, where they'll come to me on a silver platter and offer me a job. Of course, I would much rather have that. So things don't happen for the best necessarily. But there are some people who accept the situation and then are able to make the best of it. The same with any crisis. Do you think the leaders, whether the 80 and 90-year-olds, invited those crucibles into their lives, wanted these crucibles to happen? Do you think partners go into a relationship and say, let's look for that crucible, let's really fight so that we can have a healthy relationship? Of course not. But when it happens, that's when they make the best of it. You know, stuff happens. And we can either let it pollute or make fertilizer out of it. I want to show you an example, once again, of a leader who is a consummate benefit finder.
Madiba, Madiba, Mandela, Nelson, people love you. There's a message, it's strong. So let's raise our voices, let's raise our voices, let's say to the messenger.
We are honored to be talking with Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa, whose unshakable courage, his faith and integrity have inspired millions to see what is possible in their own lives. I've had the pleasure, the honor of meeting Mr. Mandela on a couple of occasions before, and I will tell you, to be in his presence is really, to be in your presence is like being in the presence of royalty and grace at the same time. I wonder, how does a man spend 27 years in prison, put there by an oppressor, and come out of that experience with not a heart of stone, not a cold heart, but a heart that is willing to forgive and embrace? I remember talking to you one night over dinner, and you had said to me that our hatred for the oppressor was so intense we did not see the value of talking to him. So at what point did you see the value of letting go of the hatred and begin the process of talking?
Well, let me say first, that it's a great tragedy to spend the best of your lives in prison. But although it looks ironical, there are advantages in that. If I had not been to prison, I would not have been able to achieve the most difficult task in life, and that is changing yourself. I would not have had that opportunity. I had that opportunity because in prison you have what we don't have in our work outside prison: the opportunity to sit down and think, which is an important part.
Did you need 27 years of it, though? Really? You could have taken a few days, a week, a vacation. Did you need 27 years?
Now, did it happen for the best that he spent 27 years of his life? Certainly when he experienced it, it was painful, it was awful, but he was able to transform this. And to even in that situation to see the positive. And when we transformed it, those who know the history of what happened to him, when he started to look at the positive even there, at the opportunities in prison, when he changed his mindset, in other words, not the external circumstances actually began to change. Another benefit finder. A pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity, an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty. and you don't want to argue with him. I want to end by telling you a story, personal story, about my experiences throughout the year. Some biographical details, some things that I think most of you do not know. And I'm going to tell it to you first from the perspective of the fault finder. I have a mild case of ADD. It makes things very difficult for me. It's difficult for me to focus, my mind wanders often, and I really struggle with it constantly. When I was in high school, I really wanted to get into a lucrative program in mathematics. Didn't pass the entry exam. Was very disappointed. Didn't make it. Becoming a professional squash player was a dream for me since the age of 11. That's the thing that I thought about constantly. That was the most important thing for me at the time. I wanted to be a professional player. At the age of 20, I was about to complete my military service in Israel and got injured on the squash court and pulled a muscle in my back. The doctor gave me an option of being operated on, which was a big risk, or giving up my professional career. I chose to give up my professional career, a dream that I had from a very young age. It was a real blow. I went to Cambridge after graduating from Harvard, and I enrolled in a PhD program. I was the only student in my PhD program to fail. I was thrown out of the program. It was humiliating. It seemed like a waste of a year because I didn't even get a master's degree. It was a real tough experience. At Harvard, as a graduate student, I took, with all the other students, my qualifying general exams. Out of all the graduate students who took that exam, I was the only one who failed it. Once again, a real humiliating experience. Walking around William James, and everyone knows the results, was tough. Not only that, I was given the provisional option of staying in the program. And they said to me, not only do you need to pass next year's exam when you take it with the next class, you have to pass it with flying colors or you're out. So while the rest of the students were working on their dissertations, writing, almost graduating, I had to go back to the basics and go over the whole material again. God, I am so unlucky. I want to share with you some biographical facts about my life. You know, I have a mild case of ADD, which is great. You know why? Because it actually forces me to only study things that I love, things that I care about, because anything else, my concentration just goes away. So it's like I have an internal mechanism that forces me to focus on the ultimate currency, on things that make me happy. And I only study things that I'm passionate about. It's wonderful. You know, when I was in high school, I really wanted to get into a certain program, in a very lucrative program, and I didn't get in. I failed the entrance exam, which turned out to be a blessing in disguise because it gave me so much more time to practice and play squash, and I ended up winning the national championships the following year, which I wouldn't have done had I been in that program. When I was at the University of Cambridge, I was in a PhD program, and I was the only one in my class, and as far as I know, the only one in years to be thrown out of the program. And it was actually a very important experience. You know, I got out of Harvard, I was arrogant, I thought I was holier than thou, and this was a real humbling experience that was especially important for me because the next year I went to work in Asia. And there, the worst thing that I could do was to be arrogant. So this humbling experience actually helped me a great deal in my future career, as well as helped me put things in perspective. When I came to Harvard, I was the only one in my program to fail the general qualifying exams. It was a hard blow, it was difficult, but it turned out to be a very good experience. You know why? Because I had to study the exact same material and these huge books and articles all over again and know them not just at the basic level. I had to know them extremely well because there was the condition that the professors gave for me staying in the program. And it was so good because I learned the material so well that I know social psychology today probably better than anyone I know. And that helps me a great deal. It helped me a great deal in putting together this course, 1504. And there is no place I would rather be than here. God, I am so lucky. Same. Okay. Same reality, different interpretations. Just remember, much of what we experience, we co-create. See you next week.